there are always systems. And if one is familiar with the symbols with this early French repertoire, then one can interpret it very differently, knowing that information. Likewise, when we approach Beethoven, Brahms, etc., there's a history there that we know. The symbols are there, but there's a lot of information that we gather from outside sources too.
I had a great time chatting with today's guest. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are digging into the world of period performance and much more with Andrew Arceci, who is a bassist in the Boston area, also a gamba player, a conductor, does all kinds of things as we dig into in this conversation. And Andrew grew up in Cincinnati, also then in Baltimore. He went to Peabody. He went to Juilliard. He spent about a decade living in the UK, studying at Oxford and playing in London, and headed to Boston and just is exploring all kinds of different projects. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation, and you'll hear some music from some of his current projects. Also, he's put out an album with Floyd's Row, the Oxford Sessions, and recorded with the Baroque Band not too long ago, and all kinds of cool stuff like that. Quick shout out to our sponsors before we get going here. D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, Steve Swan String Bass, Colstein Music, the Bass Violin Shop, and A440 Violin Shop. Thanks for keeping the lights on here at Contrabass Conversations, folks. And let's dig into this conversation with Andrew Arceci. You grew up basically in Cincinnati, right?
Yeah, so I was born in Boston, and then we moved to Cincinnati when I was quite young.
Okay.
And I started playing bass in Cincinnati. I played piano when I was quite young, and when we moved to Cincinnati, we didn't find a piano teacher quickly, and the school system had an incredible strings program. And I remember the teacher introduced the cello, and I thought that was, an interesting instrument. And then the next day she introduced bass. And, I pursued classical and jazz bass when I was in Cincinnati. And then we moved to Baltimore, and I finished high school in Baltimore. Then I stayed, and then I was at Peabody and Johns Hopkins. And then I was in New York, and then I went abroad. And
okay. Yeah, quite a journey. Well, Baltimore, that's a good place to end up as a bass player, especially with...
It's an incredible program.
Who was teaching when you were there?
So I studied with Paul Johnson.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
And I worked with others, Rob Kesselman and John Hood and others. But I think second to my father, Paul Johnson was one of the most influential, male figures, both musically, but, in terms of personal development as well.
He's an interesting guy. I had a chance to chat with him for the podcast about a year ago, I think.
Yeah. No, I was very fortunate to work with Paul through high school years, but really through the undergraduate development. I became interested in the history of the double bass and started exploring viol and violone. And a place like Peabody, because it was connected to Johns Hopkins, I took several art history classes, and all these interests fused together. I still continued, with orchestral training, et cetera, but I was quickly interested in, other genres, et cetera. And Paul is a great teacher. And I think for someone like me, who's very curious about all these, about some of these other topics, he was very supportive and, was always giving me material to read, philosophy, music related, but really anything and everything. Mm-hmm. And that's part of, one's development, not just musically, but just in terms of, exploring the world.
And that's the sort of college experience you hope to have, right? And you hope to have someone like that, a mentor like that, or someone to guide you along the process and kind of like, hey, check this out. And that's what we all are hoping for, I think.
So in that sense, Paul was a true mentor.
When was he the one who kind of opened the door to the period performance world, or how did you discover that?
Not so much, but I was always interested in earlier repertoire, but I started exploring viola da gamba and violone. There's a great performance practice program at Peabody as well, so I started playing these instruments with the Renaissance ensembles, the Baroque ensembles, and I ended up doing recitals on both instruments. I gave a formal bass recital as part of that undergraduate degree, but I also pursued viol, and I gave a viol recital as well. And so I ended up I stayed 5 years at Peabody because I was pursuing bass, gamba, and then I had taken enough art history classes, so I developed a minor in that. So I was there 5 years, and it was really, I think in the end it was great because I had another year to pursue both instruments, but also the art history.
So art history, obviously I see, well, I guess pretty obviously I see the tie-in to like period performance.
Yeah.
Right?
So, one aspect is that there's, obviously there are no recordings, and I think the aesthetic is tied into that visual or visuals, of that time, and really any time. But, as I was exploring earlier repertoire, I was exploring the visual arts as well. And, again, I think it's certainly connected. And so I was using some of that visual aesthetic to influence my approach to some of the earlier repertoire. And this is all while I was experimenting with gut strings and different bows for the first time. And I remember I wasn't entirely sure where any of that would lead me. I mean, even now, I have a pretty varied life. I like the variety, but I was just pursuing those interests because I was curious about the history of the bass. And I mean, as you know, it's a complicated history. 3, 4, 5, and 6 string instruments were used throughout Europe. And I was just fascinated by that world, and also all the tuning systems that were used, the different approaches in terms of, overhand, underhand, and some basses were fretted, others weren't. And so I was just, fascinated because there was so much variety with these early basses. And, I think that influenced some of what I was doing with, 19th century, 20th century repertoire. And then, of course, contemporary, because, again, it's all connected. And I do think that now one is expected to know, I mean, maybe not be an expert, but one is expected to know so much, to be a working musician in the 21st century. It's not just learning to play, a select number of excerpts, but there's so much involved. I mean, different genres, in terms of the online presence, contracts, there's just so much that one has to be familiar. The history, the early repertoire, really several hundred years worth of repertoire, regardless of what one does. I think, it's important to be familiar with some of that.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. There's a lot more to this music world than a lot of people realize, like in a totally different direction. I wish that every music student had to go to the NAMM show in Anaheim, which I just came from. So it's on my mind. But like nothing will put into perspective your spot in the music world like going to the NAMM show with 100,000 people, and 0.1%, maybe. Well, no, that's exaggeration. 1% of the show has anything to do with what you studied and what I studied, and I think, wow, this is my whole world, and I feel like I've got a broad scope on the world with like the various things that I do, and then you go there, you're like, oh my goodness, there are almost inconceivable number of people doing an inconceivable number of things that have so little to do with what I do, and they're all prospering and exploring and creative, and it really it's overwhelming and incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think some schools are starting to shift because, I mean, the scene has changed so much in 10, 20, 30 years. I entered undergraduate thinking that I would pursue classical and jazz bass. And within that, really 1 year, maybe 2 years, I started doing more with violin and violone. But, there's no one path to any of that. I think, at least for me, I was less interested in the orchestral route, and so I started exploring other paths. And again, there are many paths, and I think schools are starting to include not just the business aspects, especially if you're doing freelance work, and how to negotiate contracts and recording projects and press, all of that, but in terms of just doing taxes, for instance, all the practical issues that a musician needs to know now, especially if you have not just one or two jobs, but several, 10, 20, 30 different jobs.
Yeah. Well, like you, we both probably I know you do, looking through everything you do, have many, you wear many hats. And actually, I want to keep going down your path because I think it's super interesting, but maybe let's take a pause and just tell people that suite of activities that you're doing now, because you got so much going on, like 2018, 2019, just talk through some of the projects that you're involved with.
Sure. So I direct the Collegium Musicum at Wellesley College, the women's college in Wellesley, Mass. I'm there usually one day a week, and I lead that ensemble from violone, and other instruments, pending the repertoire. Yeah. And that size will vary. It's all chamber-oriented repertoire, but we'll have anywhere from 5 to 20 players and singers. So I do that once a week. I teach jazz bass at Concord Academy, which is a preparatory school, which is totally different.
Yeah, no kidding.
And I teach privately in a few other schools, both classical and jazz bass. And even just within the teaching world, I enjoy that variety. And I think anyone who teaches knows that. I still learn quite a lot from the students and how to approach the bass and approach, really anything. But in terms of as a performer, I work with a number of groups in New England. I'm trying not to travel as much. My wife and I have 2 young kids. So we have a 3-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl.
Oh, wow. Congratulations. That's no,
it's wildly fun, but very hectic.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, it was interesting because I was actually on tour with the group. I was on tour with A Far Cry earlier in the season, and we were in Santa Fe, then Los Angeles. And I realized that it was, that project was quite fun. But I also realized that it's harder and harder to be away, especially while my kids are quite young. And so I started exploring some teaching opportunities, and I was lucky to land some of that. But I still travel. I mean, it's part of what, this work is, but I'm trying to be more selective about some of that travel. It's hard for my wife if I'm away, but it's also hard to be away from her and the kids. And I think, any working musician, especially one who tours regularly, reaches that point with kids. So long story short is that I'm not touring as much these days. Most of my work is within New England, but again, I still travel when certain projects come up. Within New England, I work regularly with Emmanuel Music. There's a cantata series. They have a long list of players, so I'm one of several players. That's quite fun. Mm-hmm. So we do several Bach cantatas. We'll do other chamber and chamber orchestral projects with that ensemble, Emmanuel Music. I work regularly with Boston Camerata. That's mostly with viol and violone. We did an interesting American program, early American repertoire, and I played violone for that project. And it was looking at works by Jeremiah Ingalls and other early American composers. And part of the history of the bass includes this, Yankee bass, the church bass, American bass viol. And I ended up using a 6-string instrument for this project because it worked with the textures that we were exploring. That project was exploring early American repertoire, music by Jeremiah Ingalls. And I ended up playing a 6-string violone for that. It worked well for that repertoire and the instrumentation that we were using. But so, aside from Emmanuel Music, Boston Camerata, I work with Boston Baroque, Handel and Haydn Society. those projects, I'll usually use a 4-string, bass with gut strings. We can talk about, various equipments, if you'd like.
Yeah.
But, I work in New York, Philadelphia, and occasionally back to Baltimore and DC with different ensembles. It's pretty varied, which is good. And just this past year, I recorded several albums. I just recorded 3 new albums with this folk ensemble, Floyd's Row.
Yeah, I've been listening to that. That's awesome. Love it. Love it.
Thanks.
Super groovy.
So we recorded this album, the Oxford Session, several years ago when a colleague and I overlapped in England. And we did nearly 2 weeks of concerts this past summer. And so we took advantage of that time and some of that repertoire. We recorded 2 albums in New England, and then we recorded a live show in DC. So those projects are, we're in the midst of doing some edits and that work. And just as I look to the next month, I'm doing a contemporary project next week, and then I'm doing several projects with Boston Baroque. So it's pretty varied. And, on any one day, from teaching to playing, I have to be careful with my schedule these days, especially with a wife and 2 kids, but making sure I have, the right instrument with the right repertoire. There are many, many variables. And I think it's exciting, but it also, there are many details to keep track of. Yeah. I think one can pursue, one genre, and that's, that's lovely. For me, I like the variety. Yeah. So I like, I like that hustle. I like the variety with these projects.
Yeah, it's an interesting point with the gear. It's something like I look behind me here. There's my bass. I know if I'm doing something, I grab that maroon bag, and I'm good. All my stuff's in there. Very different prospect. If you're maybe I'm playing gamba, maybe I'm playing bass, maybe I'm playing, maybe I'm doing this tuning, maybe I'm doing this, and yeah. In addition to the gear, the the modality change. Maybe I'm going to be conducting, or
totally. And some projects will use A415, other projects will use A430, other projects will use more or less modern pitch, so A440. I have 2 basses. I have a modern bass, obviously with a modern bow. I have a Baroque bass, which is a 4-string fretted bass with gut strings, and I usually use a low D tuning, so I drop the low E to a D, so D A D G, and I use that bass for mostly 18th century projects, and it works well. Let's say if there are 2 or 3 celli on a project, I use a 6-string violone, which is essentially a large viol. That instrument works in both G tuning and D tuning. So the term violone is an ambiguous term. It just means large viola in the Italian sense. It's a large string instrument, but in the 21st century, we'll usually use a qualifier to help identify. So a G violone, a violone tuned in G. We'll use a D violone to refer to an instrument tuned in D. The Viennese bass, sometimes we'll use Viennese violone. And, so these terms help clarify because, as I mentioned, 3, 4, 5, and 6-string instruments were used throughout Europe. And, it's interesting now because some people are aware of that history, and I think as conductors or directors or programming, one may not appreciate that a particular instrument should be used, say, for Corelli, and then if something else is programmed on that same concert, that may use, like for instance, if like Mozart, Dittersdorf, Haydn, much of that repertoire would use a 5-string bass or a 5-string violone, and I mean one has to be practical because I wouldn't take 2 or 3 different instruments with me on any one gig. I mean, especially if you're traveling.
Right.
So
right.
I think it's important to be familiar with the language, with the history, but one also has to be practical in the 21st century. And we play in very different halls, very different settings than much of this repertoire would have been heard. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is one should always please the conductor or the director. I mean, I've had conversations with directors and conductors about what I think would be an appropriate instrument, but there could be other decisions involved and other factors that I may not be aware of. For instance, like the hall or a particular sound that a director or a conductor would like. And I try to honor those decisions too, because, again, I mean, if you're playing in a large hall, you may want a larger sound, a larger instrument. So if the 6-string violone is more appropriate to the repertoire, but we're playing in a different hall, perhaps the 4-string bass would be more appropriate. So those conversations come up, and I engage in those conversations. I think it's useful to have those conversations, but it's also, as a working musician, it's good to be practical, and again to please the contractor or the director or the conductor, whatever the situation is. Yeah. So I work on the 2 basses, the 6-string violone, and I have 2 viols as well. So the place is full of instruments.
This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. They're always happy to assess basses for trade-in, consignment, or even purchasing outright. Contact them to schedule a time to discuss your bass and your future needs. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. Consistency among bass lines, consistency among the different products you offer, that's something that Upton Bass excels at. Here are Gary and Eric from Upton Bass on that topic.
Like continuity of product, which we have fabulous reputation. We've got great product across the marketplace.
Do you have seconds? No.
Right, yeah, exactly. No.
Seconds are in the dumpster.
For almost 20 years, Upton Bass has been delivering top-notch basses at every price point, consistency and continuity, like Gary said, across the line. And if the wood's not good, like Eric said, it goes in the dumpster. They are the real deal, made in America. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. One of the great bass players of all time, Fred Zimmerman, former principal bass of the New York Philharmonic. He was Barry Colstein of Colstein Music. He was Barry's bass teacher. Here's Barry on Fred Zimmerman.
Anybody that knew Fred would say he was one of a kind. I mean, the man was probably the most talented, the most giving. He was the most interesting. Not only was he an amazing teacher, an amazing performer, he was an amazing artist also. He was truly a great artist.
Along with Fred Zimmerman, people like Milt Hinton, Homer Mensch, Orrin O'Brien, and so many others have had their basses worked on at Colstein's or had instruments made for them by Colstein's. Thank you, Barry, for everything that you've done for the bass world. And folks, check them out at colstein.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. How about bows? I put out a call on Facebook working on a new bow case project. I work for Eastman Strings, this company, based, and then so we're working on a bow project, and I put out just a general call, and I got so many comments from people in period performance, like a bow case that can actually hold my bows, that can hold my Dragonetti bow, that can hold 4 or 5 bows. What do you in terms of that? Like, do you play on one of those big Dragonetti bows? With the big frog?
Yeah, I have. Okay. I have several bows. The 2 that I use most regularly, I have a modern German bow, but I have a Baroque bow made by Roger Doe. I believe he's based in London, and I use that for Baroque and certainly early classical programs. I keep those 2 bows with me just because you never know. It's always good to have 2 bows with you, and I have other bows that I use on violone and viol, obviously smaller bows. But it's interesting because the viol bow is held underhand and usually have 1 or 2 fingers on the hair. So it's similar to the German approach in terms of underhand or more or less to the side. Mm-hmm. And, that history is connected as well. The 3 and 4 string basses were used certainly more in like Italian repertoire, and the 5-string, 6-string violone-based instruments were used in other parts. Again, like Mozart, Haydn, Dittersdorf, all that repertoire. And it's strange to play on a 5-string, fretted bass. I did some of that repertoire when I was at Juilliard doing this degree in historical performance, and part of that degree was exploring mostly 4, 5, and 6-string basses.
Okay, so at 5-string, let's just take that 5-string, because I'm such an amateur in this world. I find it fascinating. So let me ask a couple kind of very pedestrian questions. But like, so 5-string fretted bass. Let's just say, what tuning would one be using? Is there something standard, or what are some of the tunings you would be using?
So that's a great question. Very little is standard.
Okay.
And I mean, even with 3, 4, certainly the 5-string and 6-string, tuning systems, there were a wide range of tuning systems that were used throughout, this early history with the bass. I think now most people, certainly early period players, if you're using a 4-string, most will use the standard EADG tuning. Many will often tune the low E down to a D, so DADG. Mm-hmm. That's certainly more common because so much, if you're in the key of D major, you want that low D. And it just, I think, you start to use your mind differently with changing the tunings. I mean, if you're set with one tuning, it can be hard to adjust to that. But, with anything, with time, you just become accustomed to thinking, okay, if the low string is tuned as an E, I use it as an E. If it's tuned as a as a D, I'll use it as a D. With the Viennese tuning, the Viennese, violin, the Viennese bass, it's usually from the bottom F, A, D, F sharp, A.
Whoa, F?
Sorry.
Yeah. Wait, regular F natural?
Yeah.
Whoa.
And occasionally that's tuned to an F sharp or a low D, which is also common.
Okay.
Some of these early solos were written for an instrument like that, and we'll pull from the viol sonatas, repertoire from Bach and other Baroque composers, certainly cello repertoire. And I think one reason I was interested in this early repertoire, because it never, it can work on bass, but you realize that it was written for another instrument. Mm-hmm. And likewise with some of the early bass concerti, they work very differently on an instrument that was tuned differently and that was approached very differently. It's not to say that we can't do it on a modern, 4-string bass, but, it works differently. The 6-string violone, as I mentioned, the instrument that I have works in both a G tuning or a D tuning. I often play bass viol as well as violone on projects. So just in terms of keeping the mind oriented, I will often play a bass viol, which is tuned in D, and then my violone, which plays an octave lower than that, is also tuned in D. So with the 6-string violone, I use that instrument mostly on 17th century projects, which is, more or less chamber-oriented repertoire. So, for instance, when there's one cellist.
Okay, interesting.
And I think that it works. It's a very light texture. So the D violone and the Baroque bass play in the same octave, at the 16-foot register, but they're very different textures. So the 6-string violone is a very light texture. It doesn't have the same kind of articulation. The bowing is also opposite. So with viol and violone bowing, the strong bow is up. And so it's push pull as opposed to, modern playing, which is down up, if we think in terms of, strong weak.
Why is that? I know that's true. As someone who just, I got my regular old French bow, I haven't really experienced that. Is it because of the way you hold the bow, or where you hold the bow, or the nature?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, all of it. I mean, once you hold a bow, the viol and the violone bows are both held underhand, and again, 1 or 2 fingers on the hair, pending, style, approach, etc. But you learn to use the hair in a different way because you can actually manipulate the hair. And, so much of this early repertoire invites this strong weak element, this sort of push pull. And I think in the modern approach, I remember working very hard to make, the down and up bow very equal, and that's useful in some settings. But there's also an element that one wants sort of the strong weak aspect, and you can do that with a down up approach. I do that with the Baroque bass, and I think there are very different approaches to that. In terms of whether one wants, say, a bass line or a certain passage to be emphasized in a certain way, where you are trying to highlight certain harmonies or whatever. A certain line moves in a certain way, and you may want to emphasize strong and weak beats.
How strong and weak beats. So I played for years and years with Jerry Fuller, who's a bassist, a violin player in Chicago. Great guy, longtime friend, and I was just talking to him yesterday, actually. So Jerry, I remember playing Messiah with Jerry and looking at these marks that he was putting in the parts for like strong and weak. And so, is there any sort of established notation, or like what do you do to mark strong, weak, or phrasing? Are there any sort of things that I feel like there are things that people in that context would do that I wouldn't be doing on my Brahms symphony gig?
Yeah, no, totally. I don't think there are any. There are ways to mark strong and weak. I think every player handles it differently. Yeah. Most Baroque gigs, there's usually one, occasionally two players, and I certainly have certain markings that I use.
Yeah, like what do you do?
Well, sometimes I'll mark if something needs to be long. Obviously, I'll just mark it long. Other times, if I have the figures in the part, which suggest the harmony, eventually you learn how to read the printed music, but also the implied harmonies. And I think part of playing a continual line is really understanding that harmony, and whether you're a keyboard player, actually realizing the chords, or either a keyboard player or a pluck player, whether a theorbo or whatever else, but we can't roll the chords on cello, violone, bass, whatever, but we can still emphasize, the bass line in a certain way that provides that support. And I think if I had any advice, I would suggest learning, theory, but also learning how to look at a figured bass line and how to manipulate that. For instance, if the harmony starts to change more quickly, you would probably emphasize that bass line in a different way than if it's if the same harmony is being used over several measures. And one of the most useful classes I took was this continuo class, and learning how to process figures in a quick way. Unfortunately, most bass parts never have the figures.
Right.
So depending the project, certainly for recits, it's always good to have the actual vocal line. And in those parts, there will be figures. But even if you don't have the printed figures, it's good to consult with colleagues, whether it's the cellist or the keyboard player, and how to shape the line. So much of the music, especially with this early repertoire, comes from the bottom, and it really influences the top. It's not just a supportive bass line, but it can really propel some of this early repertoire.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, going back to Jerry Fuller, we have conversation. He's one of the people I talk to the most frequently about the experience of period performance. And then Jerry has also really gotten into jazz recently, and he's playing like trad jazz, like Dixieland, I think. Sorry, Jerry, if I'm getting this wrong, but and just talking about similarities and differences between the bass player, in a jazz combo and a bass player in a continuo. I know there are a lot of differences, but there are certainly a lot of maybe attitudinal similarities or functional similarities.
Definitely.
Yeah.
At least for me, maybe that's why I was drawn to some of that repertoire, the early repertoire, because when I was younger, I did quite a lot with jazz and rock and other genres, always pursuing classical repertoire as well. But I was really pulled to that that element of, you know, shaping a bass line in a very different way than you would in an orchestral section.
Yeah.
And, you know, for instance, when you're playing in a section, you presumably, you know, would like to blend into really, you know,
Hopefully.
and that's not to say that you don't want to blend, but in playing in a continuous section, there's a different kind of blend with the cellist between the 8-foot and the 16-foot, you know, registers. And people have different opinions about whether the 8-foot should be prominent or the 16-foot line should be prominent. And so it's not just blending with the cellist, but of course, you know, any other continuo players that you have, and then making some artistic decisions or having those decisions made, you know, for you. But, you know, if the 16-foot player doesn't play a certain passage or a certain movement, that gives a very different aesthetic. You know, those decisions can be discussed, you know, how strong continuous section should be, how it can be varied. And I've always enjoyed those conversations, and, you know, they're not usually written into this repertoire. Occasionally there will be marks that suggest that the 16-foot should not play, but usually in like fugal entrances, the cellist will usually enter with the tenor line, and then the violinic player or the bass player will usually enter with you know, the bass line in terms of choral works, and that's usually not notated.
Yeah.
But that was likely standard, and people have different opinions about that. So there's quite a lot of information that is suggested, I think, in some of these parts. So early parts very rarely will have crescendi or decrescendi, and certainly, you know, when you're looking at some of these early scores, maybe a quick glance will suggest that there's not much information, but there actually is when one is familiar with that language, that world. And there are certain ways to emphasize a line, or there could be language that suggests, you know, a crescendo or decrescendo. It's not written into the music, but like anything, when you're familiar with that style, with that language, it becomes clearer. I mean, when I do contemporary repertoire now, I'm always shocked because there's usually too much information.
Right.
and you know, one has to take a step back and think, okay, well, I mean, most of it is useful, but I mean, we live in a very different, you know, different world now, but those markings are included because they're usually very specific ideas. Yeah. I mean, to parallel that, some of the very early French repertoire, and this is not bass related, but it's with viol music. Some of those scores are very detailed. They notate obviously the music, but there are symbols that are used to designate different kinds of vibrato. So first finger vibrato, second finger vibrato, fourth finger vibrato, how to swell, and there are these symbols that aren't used in other repertoire, but it's very specific to early French repertoire. And so I think all that to say is that, you know, there are always systems. And if one is familiar with the symbols with this early French repertoire, then one can interpret it very differently, knowing, you know, that information. Likewise, you know, when we approach Beethoven, Brahms, et cetera, you know, there's a history there that we know from our teachers, but also, you know, the symbols are there, but there's a lot of information that we gather from outside sources too.
That's interesting about that. I wasn't aware of that with the French repertoire. And you're making me think about my lesson last night with a student. In the same lesson, we were doing Bach, Gigue from the first suite, you know, notationally very different from the next piece we did, which is Mahler, First Symphony. And we're all of a sudden talking about like fortissimo and wild and the different accents and like interpreting all this stuff. And so it's super interesting to watch how the specificity changes as you move through the eras.
Definitely. And you know, you mentioned that it's the interpretive aspect, because I think regardless of genre or repertoire, I mean, we interpret based on what we know. And I think one element of that is that there's quite a lot to know. And in terms of not just with earlier repertoire, but you know, approaching you know, you mentioned Brahms. I mean, I think approaching Brahms through the 20th century is a very different approach than, say, approaching Brahms through like Bach, Beethoven, in terms of that way, looking at it from, the earlier aspects
For sure.
and reaching Brahms, as opposed to looking back and reaching Brahms through, say, Mahler. I mean, that's a very different, and especially Beethoven, because when we approach Beethoven through Mozart, through Haydn, there's a very different aesthetic or a very different approach than looking at Beethoven through, the 20th century, the 19th century. And I think many orchestras are starting to appreciate that. And it's great. There's some distinction there. And I think people are more aware of some of these differences.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Did you know that you can tell the difference between D'Addario strings by the silking? Peg and silking denotes pitch and tension. So E is green, A is black, D is yellow, and G is red. C, by the way, is purple if you have a C string. A thin band of yellow just before the metal winding denotes light tension, and a thin orange band of silking denotes heavy tension. Ball end silking, that's the stuff down by the tailpiece, denotes string family like Kaplan, Helicore, or Zyex. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And Steve travels far and wide here in the Western United States. Here's Steve on where he goes and what some of the benefits of being able to travel like that are.
You travel with it. You're going up to Oregon. You're going up to Seattle.
Up to Seattle.
Yeah.
And back, out to Arizona, wherever people want to see a selection they don't have options, or if I have a line on some basses I want to check out and maybe buy or trade, I have the option. That's the beauty of me not being tied to a workbench in a shop.
Steve works with some of the San Francisco Bay Area's best professional bass luthiers, people like Nathaniel Rich, Alex Friedman, and many others, to get basses playing beautifully. When someone comes to me asking where to look for a bass, whether they're a student or professional, or they're coming through town and they want to try out a great selection of basses, I always send them to Steve. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Steve. It's interesting, and this is again coming from a kind of a period performance amateur perspective, but I can't help but notice to me, the similarity in the development of the period performance scene and the development of the double bass over the same period of time. Like if we go back to like 1972 for both of those, and just how things have changed in terms of, and talking to musicians from an earlier generation, and they're sort of, not everybody universally, but they're sort of scorn for all things period, right? I mean, I think we can safely say there was a and just how that's all evolved. And then I see a lot of parallels between the bass world and how we're evolving, and so I don't know if you've ever thought about that late at night when you can't sleep either, but I certainly have.
No, I have. I think we see that several schools are starting to incorporate that element, and it may not be it may just be a short like workshop. There may not be a period teacher, but there are ways to access, I think, some of this information, and I think the majority of schools and really teachers are maybe more receptive to some of that, and I think that's good, regardless of the path one chooses. I think at least for me, I think if you're pursuing your degree in music, I think it's important, regardless of what you would like to do, at least to be exposed to some of these ideas surrounding Baroque music. Likewise, I mean, classical music, romantic music, etc. And I think it's just as important to be familiar with contemporary classical music, but also jazz and rock. And again, I mean, there's so much to know, but I think that's part of the musical education. And I do think in the 21st century, one should be at least exposed to some of that. And it's not to say that we need to know rock history if we're working as a classical, musician, but it's part of the language. it's still part of the the industry in a way.
Oh yeah, I'm always it's kind of riffing on the topic we're both kind of talking about. I just can't help but be troubled by looking at what percentage of a music school is dedicated towards obtaining orchestral jobs, and we look at and that's a beautiful thing, and I've worked in that world a lot over the years, but like what percentage of that student body is going to be doing that specifically? It's even at anywhere outside of Curtis or Juilliard or a few schools, it's going to be like a pretty low percentage and so we have this vast world and I'm always a little troubled when I see schools dedicate so many resources toward that. And it's not like malice on the intent of the school, it's just kind of the system, and some places are changing, and I'd love to know what that Juilliard program was like when you went there, because you went there for historical performance.
Yeah. And I was part of the inaugural class, so I was the first. I was the first, violone player there, and it was fascinating. I worked with Rob Nairn,
nice, when
I was there, and it was a new program, and I think there was some pushback at Juilliard. This is a very traditional institution. Mm-hmm. There was some pushback, I think, from the larger programs. I mean, the historical performance program was quite small. Mm-hmm. So it was all chamber-oriented repertoire. And I think there was certainly press, given because it was the first year. There were several tours involved. So that was all very exciting. And I had a wild time in New York for 2 years. It was not sustainable. But, I moved from Manhattan to Oxford, and it was a shock.
Yeah, okay, that's quite so from Baltimore, which I've always loved Baltimore. I think it's a cool town, to Manhattan. Okay, so there's that already, though Baltimore's not a small town, but going from anywhere to Manhattan's a big transition. Yeah. And then to Oxford, which I've never been to. I'm sure. What was that? What are some similarities and differences or takeaways or startling moments? And again, you could probably talk about that for 5 hours, but if you could pick out a couple,
Sure. I mean, Oxford is one of the most magical places. Yeah. I had a lovely time. I went to work with Lawrence Dreyfus and to pursue both scholastic and performance studies. I was there looking at really some of these connections between violone, and bass. And Larry is someone who's bridged these worlds between performance and and scholarly based work as a scholar performer. And so I was very fortunate to work with him. The backstory is that I auditioned for the OAE, the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, and I was awarded a fellowship. So I played with them on and off for a year. So I was basically between Oxford and London. And, some of those projects with the OAE were incredible. I mean, I remember we did a Mozart and Haydn program. So this was, an orchestra with gut strings. I think we did a Brahms program, which was pretty wild to have, a period orchestra. I loved these programs. So for me, I was living in Oxford, but I was in and out of London quite a lot doing, different projects. And I was lucky to connect early to the scene in London. But, to answer your question, I think there was just as much energy in Oxford as there was in Manhattan. I mean, very different kind of energy, but people, in both cities, very international. People are passing through, international performers, international scholars, etc. So, I tried to be engaged. Very different pace on some level. I enjoyed the 2 years in New York, but it was very it was intense.
Yeah, people move quickly there. That's what I always say, especially living out here in California. I go there, it's like, whoa.
It moves quickly, and and then I was in Oxford, and I was living between Oxford, London, and Boston, And then when I moved back to the States, I moved to Boston to be with my then girlfriend, and several years later, married with 2 kids.
Well, all places that I in my mind, again, not knowing the most about the period performance scene, I think of Boston as a real hot spot. I think of New York it's a hot spot for everything. So London, I think of the Bay Area here. There's a lot of activity with Philharmonia Baroque and some other groups. And you've obviously done a lot of travel in what you do. It's trying to stay more local now because of the family, which is that's such an important thing, man. And not having kids, I can only guess. But like my wife and I come home, and like if I go away for a month, my wife is still my wife. But you go away for a month from like a 1-year-old. That's like you've missed, so that and you never get those moments back. So like that's a very
which is why I'm not doing that kind of traveling now. I'll usually do like 1-week projects, but especially while the kids are young, I just decided not to travel. I mean, when I was younger, I would fly through the night, for rehearsals and concerts, and really tried to hustle. And I think that's an important element of learning, because all in all, there's only so much that one can learn when in school. I think so much of this industry is learned on the job. And it's not just the skills, but how to interact with colleagues, how to read through contracts, how to work taxes. There's so many elements, especially if you're doing freelance work and working with a number of groups, whether they're period or modern. And I didn't learn much of those details in school. I was fortunate to work with great artists and work with some wonderful directors and soloists, etc. But there are practical elements that one needs to learn. Yeah. And that I mean, if anything, that was I don't know if it was a shock, but I definitely learned most of that, in the real world. And I'm still learning. And I think, we probably all are, because the scene has changed so much. I mean, for instance, just recording has changed. I mean, the way that one records, the way that, a label may or may not be involved now, any potential return with recordings. I mean, all of that has changed with streaming. Yep. And it can, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But I think, that's just one element that people are still exploring, like what the new format is, what the new model is. And maybe there are many models. I don't know. Yeah,
it's tough because you can't unring that bell. Streaming's not going. We can carp about it, whatever. But it's tough. You either embrace the change and learn how to flow with it. But yeah, it's hilarious. Like, so yeah, I'm 42. I look back, and so I like looking back to when I was like 18 or something. And I look at people. You were like talking to my old bass teacher, Michael Hovnanian, taught at Northwestern. He's still in the Chicago Symphony. He came in the 80s when Schulte was there, and those were just those like records. I mean, you were making some bank on those records, and fast forward to 2019, and it's a radically different scene. But then we have these tools, streaming, YouTube, social. But yeah, the business side of things is something that you do learn out in the real world. There should be some sort of. I'm thinking about this right now because I'm going to Spain in about a month, and they're having me doing a networking for musicians class. And the one thing that I have found, I've had him on the podcast before. I'll give him another shout out. He's awesome. Seth Haynes wrote this book called Break Into the Scene. That is just a no nonsense book that I'm trying to plan out this thing. I was like, you know what? I got to get out Break Into the Scene and read it again. And I went through. It's like, okay, all right, I'm gonna shout out Seth like crazy, but I'm gonna like heavily borrow from this book because it's just like all those skills. There is some specificity to the skills, like what you need to do function in the early music world, but there is some universality to these skills too, like show up on time. Don't go to a gig and ask everybody like what other gigs they're doing and call all the other contractors and try to take their gigs. But that's something that it's tough though, because like you don't want to be just like a really good networker and then not be able to like make music. So that can't come at the expense, right? Yeah.
No, and I think the learning the skills to play, to perform, to record, etc. I mean, those are the skills.
Yeah.
And then, I think, I mean, in many ways, most scenes are saturated with good players now. Mm-hmm. It's incredible. And, the level of playing in, across all instruments is quite high. But I do think that there are other elements involved in, coordinating schedules and, being a decent colleague, that's part of the industry too. And again, I mean, contracts may vary from different, ensembles, different scenes, different cities, taxes, especially if you are working in several states or different countries. I mean, it becomes complicated very quickly. And, that's an element of working, at least in my world. I mean, that is a large part of what I do now. I have several jobs, and as I mentioned before, I like the variety, but it certainly, schedules, taxes, etc. It can be complicated, and those are skills that one learns, I think, as you pursue, whatever path. I mean, you learn those skills, and I never planned it that way. I mean, I do feel fortunate that I have the variety between, performing, recording, directing, and, I enjoy that.
I was talking to, this hasn't come out yet, but it'll probably be out, right around the time we put this out. I was talking to Kenneth Knudsen, who's a jazz bassist in Scandinavia, really interesting guy. And we were talking about, this just reminded me of this, of, like he's working in very different modalities and different projects. And then he's on the plane a lot. And we were just talking about like you're working on your musicianship, and it's, and like thinking about that rather than practicing something specific. And you might have something similar because you play so many different instruments. It all is the same thing, right? It's all musicianship. And so I feel like I dedicate a chunk of my day to my musicianship, and that can be radically different. That could be like preparing for a clinic even. I have a very broad definition of that. Or working, when I was doing a lot of conducting, working on my score study, or practicing bass, or listening back to rehearsals. And so it's just interesting, I think, as we go and our suite of activities gets more complex. And even someone with a full-time job, it gets more complex. I think that's been really healthy for me, thinking about just like, I'm dedicating a portion of my day to my musicianship. And one more thing, it's always interesting to look how much more orderly our biography looks than our current, the chaos of the current moment. And then you get a couple years down the road and you're like, wow, everything just seems so orderly. And then I did this and this led to this. In the moment, it's just like, but I think a good attitude, and I could just sort of tell I would surmise you have a similar mindset, is like just approaching things from a point of contribution or abundance, rather than like what I mentioned earlier, like, hey, I got to try to take everybody's gigs. Because you're right, everything is saturated, but at the same sense, just approaching the world from a point of how can I contribute and be part of the scene versus like how can I get mine. I think that's just such a critical thing. No,
and I think the central element is to just be professional. At whether you're an orchestral musician, whether you're a studio musician, freelance musician doing, perhaps a variety of projects. I think whether you're performing, recording, whatever it is, just to be professional. And I think that, that's an important element that, one needs to learn the skills to play, to record, whatever. But, to be professional is central. I mean, if you're working as a professional, one should be a professional and act as a professional, and that, that's, being timely, being polite, being a good colleague when you're, on and off the road too. I mean, travel can be wearing. I mean, when you're on whether it's a short tour or a long tour, being a decent person,
it's the road has very different effects on different people too, and like you'd be amazed at how one seemingly cool person for a couple hours at a rehearsal, that's a real different thing when you're when you're around them for a week or longer. And it's always interesting to me the effect that being on the road has on, like, I definitely hit a point where I don't, and again, I don't have kids, but like a couple weeks a month on the road, even right now, I'm cool with. More than that, I start to really wish I was back home. So I'm trying to schedule my projects that way, not be out for like all the weeks. But I get jazzed up and inspired and excited about going to a new place and working with a new set of colleagues. And I think I have I try to keep my habits as similar as possible, even when I'm out of town. How does that work for you?
Yeah. In some ways, well, firstly, I treat that differently now, with kids. So I'm certainly more selective with projects, and certainly while the kids are so young. Sure. I think I still hustle, but I definitely took a step back.
Okay.
And to be honest, it was hard because I'm not necessarily looking for opportunities, but I'm eager. Yeah. And I'm always looking to explore, new projects and, new sounds, et cetera. So I took a step back, and it's been good. I think there are times in one's life, certainly when I was younger, when I was, in school, to pursue anything that I could, really.
Right,
I was just trying to learn, trying to, listen. And now again, I'm maybe more selective, but something that I've enjoyed doing, I've been recording more recently. Oh, okay. And that's cool. Been fun with some studio work, soundtrack work. That's been fun. I've worked with several composers. I did these recent recording projects with Floyd's Row, and I've done some other recording projects, in the last 2 years. And, I enjoy doing that work. So that's been a fairly new element to, like the my schedule. Yeah. But my schedule changes from day to day, and that can be hard.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome. We could talk for like 5 more hours, and we should. Sure. So I would love to have you back sometime for a round 2, or like an in-person, even better. I know you're not on the road as much, but hopefully you make it out to the Bay, California at least once in a while, maybe the Bay Area. I'll certainly be in Boston relatively soon. But let me ask you my traditional final question, if that's okay. So go back in time to Andrew, maybe right when you were about to start Peabody or somewhere in that time frame, 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, and give him a little bit of advice.
It's a great question. I teach now, and I think advice is interesting. I have a very different outlook of the scene as a as a working musician. Yeah. I remember something that I was told when I was younger is that one's relationship with the arts will change when money's involved. Mm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. I think anyone who, as you work as a professional and as contracts and finances are involved, that's an element. But I think not to let that interfere with one's, artistry. And I think obviously there are bills, but I think having a clear sense of one's identity and one's, artistry is important. And that has changed for me. Over the years, I think, even just within 5 years, my life has changed and my artistry and my, my goals. And so I think the advice I would give is that, be open to that change and to explore opportunities as they come up, because you never know.
Yep. You never know. That's true. Most people do not do what they thought they were going to do at 18. Even if they thought they were going to do that and they're doing that, it's still not the way that they expected. And the path is not clear most of the time. Yeah, you got it.
I think knowing that it may change is fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Andrew, you rock. Thanks for chatting. I really appreciate it, and we'll definitely do a round 2 at some point in the future. And thank you so much for following along and listening to this podcast. I have such a great time. I would do it even if nobody listened because I love hanging out with folks like Andrew, but I appreciate you listening. So thank you for following along. Reach out to me, us, the team at feedback@contrabassconversations.com, and I will get back to you, respond to every message. It might take a few days, but we'll get back to you. And speaking of the team, Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch makes beautiful basses and works on basses in the Dallas area. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. Thank you to Krista Copper for cataloging and archiving all of the topics we cover on these hundreds of episodes. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.